What's the difference between a tavern, an inn and an alehouse in the medieval period? Or are they the same thing? Taverns, inns and alehouses are three establishments where alcohol was served. But what's the difference? Well, taverns were introduced by the Romans. Comes from the Latin taverna, which is an inn. But it has a bit of a specialist sort of connotation. Taverns in the medieval period were where you could drink wine, and they were considered to be a little more upmarket than your average drinking establishment, although they varied, as you can imagine. There were really upmarket taverns and really quite down and dirty taverns, of course. Now, wine in the medieval period is any alcoholic beverage which is brewed from fruit. So obviously the fruit of the grape, that's what we know as wine, and most of the wine in this country that was imported was red, but English wine did exist. So the fruit of the grape, but also technically cider and perry, cider being from apples and perry being from pears, were incredibly popular and were considered to be wines because it's a fruit. We don't really think of them as wines anymore. Although people today do make elderberry wine, which I always thought was a bit strange, but of course elderberry is a fruit, and therefore if you make wine from it, then that's what it actually is. It's literally a wine. So wine was broadly served in taverns, and possibly light meals, but other forms of entertainment as well, but possibly not the lower end of entertainment that might be expected in other places. So they did consider themselves a cut above the other places. In the medieval period, London had a population of about 80,000 people, and there were over 350 taverns within the city walls, which means there was a tavern for every roughly 250 people. It's quite a lot of taverns, actually, if you can imagine that. Now, each tavern was run by a vintner, a purveyor of wines, and often those vintners would be wholesale wine salesmen as well. They would keep a cellar. That wine would be sold on and off the premises. And there was a guild of vintners, and the guild of vintners still exists today in London, has been continuously there for hundreds of years, since the medieval period. The guilds tried to maintain a monopoly on the trade, but also they tried to maintain quality, and you could be thrown out of the guild if you were serving bad wine. And one of the interesting laws about taverns was that during opening hours, the vintner was supposed to keep the cellar unlocked and was supposed to allow a client to go and visit the cellar to see exactly what kind of wine was being served. They could actually go and check the markings on the barrel and check that it was from the place it was supposed to be. And vintners that served bad wine, or wine that was gone sour, or wine that was actually adulterated with water perhaps, were punished by going into the stocks. And sometimes the remains of what they were selling, their bad wine, was tipped all over their heads. So occasionally you might see a vintner covered in wine sitting in the stocks. Well, that means he's a bad person. Probably be thrown out of the guild as well and lose his job. So the rules around owning a tavern were fairly strict. I'm sure they weren't always followed though, of course, otherwise the laws wouldn't be needed. Now, the most expensive wine was called Rhenish wine, which comes from the Germanic areas. That was imported a long way. That was supposedly quite sweet. And the value of wine in the medieval period really depended on its sweetness. So the sweeter the wine, the more expensive it would be. A lot of the wines came from Gascony in northern France, and those were roughly 4 times as expensive as an equivalent amount of ale. And they were sold by the cup. So wine was available if you had a reasonable amount of money. It wasn't particularly expensive, but it was a lot more expensive than ale. And typically ale was drunk by the working classes as well as the tradesmen. There was a type of wine grown in England as well, which is typically white wine, which is interesting. But a lot of that didn't really get sold in the taverns as such, because it was often grown by the clergy and grown by the nobility and consumed on their own premises. So they grew their own wine effectively, which is kind of interesting. And today there's a little bit of English wine grown in the southern parts of England. Two other drinks which I haven't mentioned yet are mead and metheglin. Mead is honey, is fermented honey. Metheglin is fermented honey and fruit juice as well, combined. Now those appear to have been available at taverns, but were not particularly popular as far as I can tell. They seem to have been reserved for special events. They seem to be those sort of drinks that you would drink at a feast or at a wedding. And of course, weddings give us the term honeymoon, where the couple would often drink a lot of honey, a lot of mead for a month after their wedding. And I guess that was a form of luxury that wouldn't be available to them later. And also you had cider and perry available in the west of England quite a lot. And in the west of England, there seems to be so much of that it was roughly half the price of ale. So cider and perry were stronger in alcohol, but also half the price, and certainly a lot cheaper than wine. Inns are really associated with travellers. The idea of an inn was that it's a place to sleep overnight, a place to rest, to get some food, stable your horse if you've got a horse, look after your mule if you've got a mule, your pack ponies, whatever it might be. They could be safe and looked after. And you could get a little bit of R&R, you get a bed for the night, might be in a communal bed, by the way. People slept sometimes 12 to a bed, or you might just get a corner, or if you're really cheap you might be sleeping in the stables. But it was somewhere associated with, it was a little bit organised, a little bit safe. You could meet fellow travellers, you could sort of recharge, and then you go on your way again. Lots of inns were based at the gates to big cities or towns. They're a place that's convenient, so if you're a traveller, well, you get to the place you're going to and you think, I'm really knackered, I need to have a rest. So the closest place is the gate, and therefore you go to the easiest inn you can find, and that was the one that you saw when you first got to the place you're going to. Other sorts of inns were placed at convenient distances from one place to another, roughly a day's comfortable travel. Maybe not a day's ride exactly, but 3/4 of a day's ride, maybe a whole day's walk. Sometimes at crossroads, but on major roads. And you'll see these in England as well. There's one in particular that I remember passing. It's close to the Fosse Way, and it's in the middle of nowhere really, except if you look at it on a map, it's about 20 miles from one town and 20 miles to the other. In the middle of nowhere, but a good place for everybody to stop. So it was good for business because everybody was going to stop there basically. So they were melting pots for all sorts of types of people. You would also have people from all walks of life. So there were a variety of different qualities of accommodation often available. In the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer talks about little more than a journey from one inn all the way through various other inns to the eventual Canterbury. And it starts at an inn called the Tabard Inn. Now, tabard is associated with a type of clothing used to go over armour, often had heraldry on it, so it's a very knightly thing. It was south of the river in a place called Southwark. Now, Southwark back then was fairly notorious. It was notorious because it was out of the bounds of the city walls. It was out of the bounds of the city laws as well. So you could just cross the river, you'd get to Southwark, and it was notorious for bear baiting, cockfighting, prostitution, gambling, all sorts of nefarious activities, which is presumably why Chaucer started his journey there, emphasising perhaps the lack of religious seriousness of these pilgrims on their way to Canterbury. You might not realise, but the Tabard Inn still exists. You can actually go and have a pint there to this day. Alehouses were little more than somebody's accommodation, somebody's house, open to the public, hence public house, which is what we use in Britain to this day to describe pubs. Public house, that's what it means. Really, what that amounted to was a woman, it was usually a woman of the household, brewing sufficient beer for more than her family. So she had excess, and it was an easy way to make some money. They brewed ale, not beer at this stage, but ale, which is barley, malted barley, sometimes oats. Take the juice from that and you ferment it Sometimes you can add spices if you want to change the flavour, but broadly speaking you don't. It's fairly sweet compared to modern beer, and it has a very high nutritional value, so people effectively use this as liquid bread. It was a very important component of the peasant diet, of the ordinary person's diet. And remember, at this stage in history in medieval England, 95% of the population were peasants. They were farmers, subsistence plus farmers. In times of plenty, they could sell excess food, but sometimes they went a little bit without. But alehouses, and sometimes there were quite a lot of these, there were villages and towns rather than cities as such, run by women, and people would go in there, drink the ale until it ran out. Ale doesn't keep for very long either, so you have to really encourage people to drink the whole brew today, maybe tomorrow. Third, fourth day, probably it's starting to go sour. There's some suggestion that some of the spices and herbs that could be added could extend the life. And hops, the bittering agent that makes beer from ale effectively, that bittering agent really didn't start to be used extensively until the very end of the Middle Ages. It was really a Renaissance drink. Beer's a Renaissance drink and ale is a medieval drink. It was used a little bit, it was introduced, and it caused a little bit of controversy because this sort of newfangled bitter drink was considered to be a bit foreign, and so some people thought it was a bit dodgy, but it became very popular very quickly. And hops have the effect of lengthening the life of the beer. It makes it last longer in the vat, so you could make a brew and it would be drinkable for a couple of weeks, possibly only a week, depends on the temperature. At this time period, it's unlikely that ale was sold in sort of regulated volumes. The wholesale price was regulated. Magna Carta talks about a London quarter being the unit of selling of wholesale ale, but the individual person probably just brought their own cup, probably their own pot. They talk about having pots of beer, or mazers. Mazers are bowls, not really flagons in the way you might imagine from a later period. Some kind of drinking vessel, but I guess you tried to have the biggest drinking vessel possible. I don't know whether you got charged more if you had a particularly big drinking vessel. We just don't know about that. I haven't seen any evidence whatsoever. How do you advertise the fact that you've got a brew on if it's just a public house? Well, the answer is you put a branch or a broom outside, something to indicate that there is a brew on, that everybody in the local area would know. It's like, oh, Mrs. Miggins has got a brew on, right, we'll go round there and we'll have a bit of a booze up and a bit of a party. Not really a party, I suppose, but a bit of a social event. And she's very good at brewing beer, so her beer's excellent. The price of beer was controlled by statute law. So it was 1 penny for 4 gallons of beer. Now that does slightly vary if the price of barley changes a bit, but broadly speaking, it was 1 penny for 4 gallons. That gives you an idea. The ale wasn't that strong necessarily. It's probably a bit more like light beer today. So 2%, 3%, not really compared to the strong ciders, certainly not as strong as wine of the period. So it could be drunk without too much inebriation. Although, as the coroner's reports attest, people did get absolutely plastered and sometimes kill themselves as a result of falling over. The alehouses started to become a bit more professional, and the sign outside started to get more gaudy. So in an environment where people weren't necessarily very strong readers, illiteracy is another topic, but people could read but not very well. What you needed is a way of saying, the house 4 doors down with the red door has got a good ale on, go there and have a drink. What they started to do is put painted signs outside. So rather than saying the house 4 doors down with a red door, you would say the house with a painted sign of a red lion outside it. Go to the Red Lion. Everybody would know where it was. Go to the Prince's Arms. Go to the King's Head. These are all recognisable symbols, often of a medieval period if you look into it. And they help to identify the location of the alehouse, which I think is fascinating. Now, sometimes these signs got a bit awkward. They stuck out too far into the road and they caused a nuisance. So from the period we have rules about how big these signs are allowed to be and how heavy they could be as well, because obviously if they fell down and fell onto people, that would be an issue. So they couldn't be over a certain set size. which is really interesting. It shows you that people were probably breaking those rules and having massive signs outside to say, come and get your ale here. Very useful source of extra income for the woman of the household too. You may have noticed I've not spoken about spirits very much in terms of drinking, and that's because they weren't widely drunk at all. In fact, they really weren't known particularly as a drink in the medieval period. Distillation of perfumes and oils was known about since antiquity, and it was also known about in the medieval period. We have a record of 13th century Italy of people distilling alcohol from wine and producing a very strong substance, but it wasn't used to drink. It was specifically used to treat smallpox, so it was considered to be a medicine as opposed to a drink. Now, we do, at the end of the medieval period, start to hear stories of people dying tragically through drinking too much of what they called aqua vitae. This is the water of life. This was distilled alcohol. But right at the very end of it, and it appears that drinking it was fairly unusual. It certainly wasn't served in taverns, inns and alehouses at all. And everybody thought of it as a medicine rather than a type of drink. Whiskey, being distilled from beer, doesn't really appear until after the medieval period. And distilled drinks in general are post-medieval. In fact, in the 17th century, gin was so cheap that it caused a lot of societal problems. It was sold to people in pints, so imagine drinking a pint of gin and what that does to you. Well, it was a big problem actually, and they had to bring in quite a lot of laws for that. Did medieval people drink to excess? Yes, of course they did. Just as today, some people drink too much of whatever it is their favourite booze might be. And the coroner's records, which we have, show an extensive number of deaths by accident. A number of cases, one in particular, a gentleman was pissing in the local pond and overbalanced, fell in and drowned. Another one was going home after visiting the alehouse with a pot of ale. So that's interesting. That's sort of off-market, taking the booze back home with you. So there's a little bit of evidence. But he was taking a pot of ale home with him when he was bitten by a dog. He stooped to try and pick up a stone and throw it at that dog, whereupon he tumbled over and smashed his head open on a wall. It's pretty bad. And one unfortunate chap was going home after drinking far too much in the local alehouse and fell in the town well and drowned. Really unpleasant deaths, I suppose, but people fall over when they're drunk. They did back then, still doing it today.